Dermot Power back here again about the history of not only Waterford but indeed Ireland. And one of the most momentous happenings in the history of Ireland was the coming of what was called the Normans. Who were they and why did they come here? Well, the plot is worthy of any good soap opera, and it all centres around a woman. Her name is Dergvilla, and she was married to Tiernan O'Rourke. He was the Prince of Breffni. That's County Leitrim, County Cavan and parts of the neighbouring counties. Now, Dergvilla had a passion for the King of Leinster. His name is Dermot Power, and he similarly had a passion for her. So they made an agreement that he would come along and take her away from her husband. And what happened then? Tiernan O'Rourke, he went to Rory O'Connor, who was the High King of Ireland, and said to him, look, he said, I've been done a great injustice and I want you to help me. So he did. And he went to Mael Lachlan, the King of Meath, to Torkel, the King of the Vikings of Dublin, and other princes, to join up against Dermot Power. Now, Dermot Power had his palace in Ferdin's in County Wexford. So he knew that the odds were against him, and so he fled and went to his abbey in Ferdin's, and from there he went over to England, and from there to France to plead for help from King Henry II of England. Now, Henry II was probably one of England's best kings, one of the most military kings, and he was also king of parts of France, in Normandy, Antoine, Anjou, and he was received very well by Henry, Dermot was, and he said to him, look, he said, you have my permission, go back to England. If you find any Normans that are prepared to help you, they have my blessing. So he came back to Wales, and this is very interesting because people think that the Normans came from England. Well, in actual fact, in 1066, William the Conqueror came over and invaded England. So we're talking about 100 years later. And the Normans had settled all over England, and an awful lot of them has settled in Wales. And the people we'll be talking about are mostly the people that were called the Cambro-Normans. And they're people, Normans, who lived in Wales. So Dermot returned to England, and he set about trying to get people to help him come over. And one fellow he met was a fellow called Richard de Clare. He was known as the Earl of Sturgill and Chepstow. His nickname was Strongbow because of his prowess with the bow, presumably the longbow. So Dermot made him an offer, so to speak, that he couldn't refuse. And that was that he could have his daughter's hand in marriage. And when Dermot died, that the whole of his kingdom, which was Leinster, that's comprising the county Wexford, almost up as far as Dublin, would be his kingdom. And, of course, Strongbow wouldn't turn that down, and he decided that he'd accept his offer. But it didn't end there, because Dermot also dispatched letters over to the Normans in England through his interpreter, a fellow called Maurice Regan. And he also found some more Norman knights that were prepared to come over in a promise of getting land off of Dermot Power. Because Dermot presumed not only to get his own kingdom back, but to establish himself in Ireland as a major king and to grab as much land around as he could. So the first fella that agreed to come over was a fellow called Robert Fitzstevens. He landed in Bannow, Bag and Bun, down in County Wexford, and there's a great line in an old Irish poem saying that it was at the creek of Bag and Bun that Ireland was lost and won. So he landed there, and he was accompanied by Milo Fitzhenry and Milo Fitzdavid and Henry Mountmorris. Now, these knights were accompanied by 30 men-at-arms, 60 men in half armour, and about 300 archers and foot soldiers, who were tenants and retainers. Fitzstephen's party was followed the next day by another under the command of a noble knight called Maurice Pendergast. He was accompanied by 10 men-at-arms and a large body of archers. Now, the archers, the knights would have worn armour, but the main weapon that they had were these archers, and in particular the longbows. They were devastating. These guys were unbelievably strong. It was extremely difficult to draw back the longbow, but all these people, archers, were actually very competent and could shoot at great distances and with great effect. When Dermot Power heard of the arrival of these early Normans, he sent down his son, Donald, at the head of 500 men and joined up with the Normans. They marched to siege Wexford town. Now Wexford, that town, as you probably know, was a Danish town. And so the Danes heard of the coming of this army and they went out to meet him with 2,000 men. But when they saw what confronted them, and that was a body of horsemen in bright armour, another division with helmets and shields, and a third then with the English longbow, they knew they were up against something very, very powerful and indeed very strange. So they fled back inside Wexford town. Twice the Normans tried to break through the walls and failed. Now there was some clergy with the Normans and inside in the Danish town, because the Danish would have been Christian at this stage. They had a bit of a parley and decided that they would make an agreement, and they opened the gates and left the Normans in. Now Dermot, in thanks to the Norman knights and these aforementioned knights that I mentioned, he gave him instantly a grant of land. To Fitzstephen, to Harvey Mountmorris, he was the uncle of Strongbow, he granted lands between Wexford and Waterford, and he gave these men 100,000 acres each, a huge amount of land. So the United Army, now composed of Anglo-Norman, Welsh, Irish and Danish troops, marched from Ferns against Donald Kilpatrick, Prince of Ossory. Now Ossory is almost the present County Kilkenny, and parts of other counties involved in it. Now this fellow was a very accomplished warrior, and Dermot warned the Normans that this was a very, very courageous and effective Irish warrior. And so Kilpatrick, he got himself in the middle of a bog with 2,000 soldiers and tried to entice the Normans to come in, and obviously some form of guerrilla warfare was going to take place. One of the Normans said to another group of Normans, "Hide in that thicket over there in these bushes until the Irish pass and ambush him." And that's exactly what happened. 200 of the Irish were killed. Their heads were cut off and they were brought to Dermot MacMurrough and placed at his feet. And the next thing that happened is quite horrific, because Dermot began to pick up the heads one by one and looking at him, looking as if to recognise some of the heads, somebody he knew. And he kept going through the heads until he found the head that he was looking for. And when he did find it, he started biting off the nose and the lips. Another batch of Normans and Welshmen under the command of another Norman knight, Maurice Fitzgerald, with 2 ships and 10 men, 30 mounted retainers and 100 archers and foot soldiers, they were able to land at Wexford because Wexford had already been taken by the Normans. So Dermot MacMurrough was delighted to hear of this new arrival and resolved to take advantage to besiege Dublin, which was now obviously a Viking town. Now, an interesting thing about Dublin and Dermot MacMurrough was that Dermot MacMurrough's father was just called MacMurrough, and MacMurrough means son of Murrough. So the original guy was just Murrough, and he was king and claimed kingship over Dublin, and the Vikings were to pay tribute to him. And they refused to recognise him and to pay tribute, and there was a battle ensued, and Murrough was killed. To add insult to injury, they buried him with a dog, which was a terrible insult to an Irishman. And Dermot swore that one day he would revenge his father. Now, another batch of Welshmen were on the sea, under the leadership of probably the most famous Norman commander in Ireland. His name was Raymond le Gros. Now, in French, that means le gros means a fat, essentially fat. He was described in the annals of being very stout, a little above the middle height. His hair was yellow and curly. He had large grey round eyes. His nose was rather prominent. His countenance high-coloured, cheerful and pleasant. And though he was somewhat corpulent, which essentially means fat, he was also very lively and active. And such was his care of the troops that he often passed the whole night when they would be out camping on manoeuvres. He'd spend the whole night checking on his troops, and he's probably the most loved of all the Normans that came to Ireland. Now, the best known of the Norman knights was, of course, Strongbow, as I mentioned earlier, and he came from Pembrokeshire in Wales. So he arrived in Waterford with 15 or 1600 soldiers and landed here on the 23rd of August. The following Tuesday, they joined up forces with Raymond le Gros, who was already before the walls of Waterford with his banners flying. Having been twice repulsed by the townspeople, they discovered that somebody had built a house on the walls of Waterford, and it was protruding out from the walls, supported by two beams. Strongbow ordered in some knights in armour, and obviously shields and that covering them, to chop down the beams, which they did. And when the house fell, it took with him a great portion of the wall, and the Normans got in through the hole in the wall, and they slaughtered all around him. And we're told that the blood flowed down the streets of Waterford and into the river. And where we'll be talking about there will be probably down around the Reg, that area there. Now there was two Viking chiefs that were in Reginald's Tower at the time. Both had the name Sitrick. They were killed. The Reginald, who was also a Viking chieftain and probably the main chief of the Vikings in Waterford, was captured, as was Malachy of Failón, Mael Shocklin of Failón, King of the Dacians here in Waterford, and they had come in to help Vikings in the battle. They were captured and about to be killed when who arrived on the scene? Only Dermot MacMurrough with his daughter Aoife to be married to Strongbow. So Dermot MacMurrough pleaded for the lives of Reginald and of Mael Shocklin of Failón, and their lives were spared. And so they decided straight away that after the marriage they would raise their banners and march to Dublin, and that's exactly what happened. There is a very interesting description of Strongbow. I often wondered about these people, like what do they look like? I'd love to see him, I'd love to meet him, whatever. But as I said, there's some brilliant descriptions of some of these leaders. As I already mentioned about the description of Raymond le Gros, the Norman knight, I also discovered one of Strongbow. And what it says was that his complexion was somewhat ruddy. I suppose that means like a high colour or red cheeks. His skin freckled, he had grey eyes, feminine features, a weak voice and a short neck. For the rest, he was tall in stature and a man of great generosity and of courteous manner. What he had failed to accomplish by force, he succeeded in gentle words. In time of peace, he was more disposed to be led by others than of command. Out of the camp, he had more the air of an ordinary man-at-arms than of a general-in-chief. But in action, the mere soldier was forgotten in the commander. So that's an absolutely beautiful description of Strongbow. So off the lads go anyway, the Normans and the Irish and the Danes off to attack Dublin. In the attack on Viking Dublin, the Norman cum Irish army consisted of Milo de Cogan with a regiment of 700 strong, accompanied by Donald Kavanagh, that's Dermot MacMurrough's son, and his Irish troops. Next was Raymond le Gros with his regiment of 800 Irish, and with him Dermot MacMurrough with 1,000 of his Irish soldiers. In the rear were 3,000 English and was commanded by Strongbow, and the rear of him again was another regiment of Irish. When the Irish king, Rory O'Connor, had set up towards Clondalkin to actually meet this army coming up, he had an army of 30,000 troops. But when he saw the army coming against him, much like the Vikings who saw this army outside the walls of Wexford, he was appalled, so much so that his judgment was, I better get out of here fast, and that's exactly what they did. They got out of there, and Dublin was easily taken and committed to the guardianship of the Cogan, while Strongbow returned south and Dermot went north in pursuit of his old enemies, O'Connor, that's Rory O'Connor, the High King, and O'Rourke, of course, the husband of his beloved wife Durdfella. However, Dermot MacMurrough was soon to die, and his death is recorded in the Four Masters in the following. 1171, Dermot MacMurrough, King of Leinster, who had spread terror throughout Ireland after putting the English in possession of the country, committing excessive evils against the Irish people and plundering and burning many churches, among which were Kells, Clonard and others, died this year of an intolerable uncommon disease. He became putrid while living by the miracle of God and through the intervention of Columcille, Fineen and other saints of Ireland for having violated and burdened their churches. He died at Ferns without making a will, without penance, without the Eucharist, and without extreme unction, as his evil deeds deserved. Now the famous Strongbow was soon to follow him. He died in 1176. He died of an ulcer of the leg and was buried in Christchurch, and his tomb is still there to the present day. His most famous general, Raymond le Gros, retired to his Wexford estates and died there in 1182. Now, a few years later, well, 10 actually, Dermot, the lover of Dermot Power and the wife of Tiernan O'Rourke, died in the monastery of Mellifont near Drogheda. Henry II landed at Waterford on the 18th of October 1171 with 400 large ships heavily laden with men and horses, 500 knights or men at arms in complete armour, 4,000 archers and horsemen. Many Irish kings and chieftains came to Waterford and submitted to Henry, and for 800 years the English ruled over Ireland and the Irish became serfs in their own land. Now, the fact that Henry II, I know Wexford was taken before Waterford, but Henry came as King of England, and we can say with certainty that Waterford city was the first acquisition by the English and the first city conquered and retained by the English up to 1922, you could say, for almost 800 years on. But what happened after that is fascinating, and I'll tell you that now. For a few hundred years, the Irish and the Normans, they kind of looked after themselves. But very curious about the Normans was that they began to become Irish. As the saying goes, they became as Irish as the Irish themselves. Now, they probably found it expedient to do that, and probably just as easy to have peace as war, and there was quite a lot of war and very little peace. But you would find in the old, in the fiends of the Tudor fiends, you would find that the Normans had adopted Irish names. In particular, their description of their hair. So they might be known as Peers. Now, they always retained their Norman names, like Piers, for example, one of the powers. Piers Rua, Fitz Power, or Fitz Lepore. And Fitz is another name, more or less, for son. But the Rua, or it could be Dove or Down. Find Piers Dove. And all these descriptive names were actually adopted. They actually also operated under the Brehon law, a great many of them. And the powers in Waterford operated under the Brehon law, I know that. And now the Brehon law was the Irish law. And after Magna Carta, and you had the introduction of the common law, which we actually have now. And that happened by Henry II, as I spoke about the King of England. His son, King John, was forced by the barons in England to produce what was called the Magna Carta. And you could see the development of the common law and the commons becoming involved in the dispensing of law and protection under that law. But in Ireland we had the Brehon law, B-R-E-H-O-N, Brehon. And there are many, many books on Google, books about that. But it would be very akin to what you would now hear about in Islam, Sharia law. It would be akin to that, and there was penalties for almost everything that had to be. So it was very, very regulated, this idea. We had the Brehon judges, we had the bards, and all that in the Irish law. And I think it was actually nearly up to the time of Queen Elizabeth that the last Brehon judge in Ireland was ordained. Now, I stand to be corrected on this, but I think, again, it was in Waterford that the last Brehon judge was, as they call, ordained, and that was by a Norman. So, but all the land in Ireland eventually became under the rule of, particularly from Queen Elizabeth on. An example is, Queen Elizabeth gave Walter Raleigh 40,000 acres in Waterford and Cork. The Cavendish family, they took over, the Boyles actually bought the land off of Walter Raleigh, and then eventually went down through marriage and that into the Cavendishes, who still own it to the present day. 42,000 acres that Richard Boyle bought off of Walter Raleigh for £1,000. But the rent off of that per year was £1,000. Unbelievable. So the Duke of Devonshire in the 1870s owned 60,000 acres, which included 32,500 acres in County Cork and 27.5 in Waterford. To the present day, the Cavendishes claim the right, and have the right, of the fish in the river, the Blackwater, up there by Lismore. They also have the mooring rights to Youghal Harbour. That means you cannot put down moorings for your boat. Not even Cork County Council can do this without first consulting the Cavendishes. The Marquess of Conyngham, another family who came into Ulster in the early 1600s, this again in the 1870s, owned almost 157,000 acres in Meath, Clare and Donegal. Until 1900, the greater part of Ireland, of the land in Ireland, that's 97% in 1870, was owned by men who rented it out to tenant farmers rather than cultivating it for themselves. So what happened from Queen Mary, this is Queen Mary, was Henry VIII's daughter. From that you had 5 plantations, as they were called, because the Irish would always remain Irish and Gaelic, except the guys who were bought off. Like the line in that famous Scottish song, "For English gold we were bought and sold, for a parcel of rogues in this nation." Great song. So there was 5 plantations. The first one was during Queen Mary I, and the plantation of Laois and Offaly. And the second one was the plantation of Munster under Queen Elizabeth, and an awful lot of English planters. When they said about the plantation, meant that the land was taken from the Irish and given to English people who would come over and occupy it. Then you had the plantation of Ulster in 1609, which was under King James. And then you had a plantation of Cromwell in 1652. And that indeed not only displaced the Irish, it also displaced the Old English, that the Normans, the Powers, the Butlers, the Ormonds, the Thomans, the whole shooting gallery were playing. Waterford City was taken up. Faithleague, as we know it, belonged to the Elwards, and a Cromwellian soldier got that by the name of Bolton. So all these people, and that was up to quite recently that all these people had that land. And it remains a source of mystery to me that when we became a free state in 1922 and a republic in 1949, that none of our politicians were brave enough to step up and say, "Right lads, you have it for long enough, sling your hook, get out of here, no compensation, nothing," and give it back to the people who owned it, the Irish people. And so I hope you enjoy that and little talk about the Normans and the coming of the English. It's a great, great, great story, and don't forget it started with the love of a woman. Talk to you shortly in another little episode.